On my first morning back, I headed to West Point at sunrise to meet up with head of security and one of our social workers. Approaching, we found the entrance completely cordoned off by the military. The entire community had been quarantined a day or so earlier as a consequence of the ransacking which took place at the school that had been converted into an Ebola overflow center. Ebola is transferred through bodily fluids such as vomit, diarrhea, blood, and sweat, which were soiled all over the stolen items, government officials presuming that the riots and looting would result in a major spread of the virus within West Point, had made the decision that a full community quarantine was the only answer. The West Point Peninsula has one paved road with two entry points. The road is narrow and in the shape of a lowercase h. The top of the H opens up to the ocean, and the right side of the H is the loop where outdoor markets normally are. On an ordinary day, the market would have been bustling with local merchants. Many of our students' mothers sold fresh fish there. The lower left stem of the H was where I used to meet up with my fixer in front of Echo Bank. That entrance was now heavily guarded by soldiers and policemen who had erected barricades. There were hundreds of people in a long line waiting to deliver food and goods to their relatives and friends inside of West Point whose survival was at stake. The tension in the air was so thick you could cut it with a knife. A 17-year-old boy who'd wanted desperately to leave had just been shot by police and bled to death the day before after trying to cross the blockade. This lethal use of force sent the message that the government was serious about keeping the community in lockdown and further riled those within. There were strict orders in place so that no one was to enter or leave the area, but because I was close to the head of police intelligence, who knew my organization had deep ties to this community, PI made a few phone calls and secured permission for me and a small group of our staff to cross over. As a token of our gratitude, we brought the guards who were defending the dividing line a supply of hand sanitizer and gloves. Much to the surprise of West Pointers, who were both outraged and panicked, seeing our team cross over and step officially into the quarantine zone caused one man, who I immediately recognized as the father of one of our students, to exclaim, "There's no limit to what you'll do for your girls." I met his gaze and waved in recognition. Although our academy was closed, my local team were adamant they would continue to serve our students throughout the epidemic. Before I had arrived, many of them had taken on great personal risk, checking in on our girls several times prior to the imposed quarantine. The culture of our young but growing organization had its challenges, no doubt, but what bonded all of us together and what made us stand out was the unrelenting love we shared for our students. For many of us, our work was a calling more than a job. Down a short strip of empty road, we arrived at an area that was sectioned off with long yellow caution tape, where a gathering crowd was screaming at those in uniform. Police officers, DEA agents, and immigration officers had joined forces with the local military. Many of them were in full riot gear. My heart raced as we moved deeper inward into the blighted neighborhood. One of our older students, a teenager, spotted me, and I seized the opportunity to express my joy and proceeded to jump excitedly up and down, blowing air kisses at her. She giggled as her face lit up. I asked her to help us locate the rest of the girls, and by the end of a long day, I was relieved to have confirmed that all 150 of our students were safe and, for the time being, healthy. One of our 7-year-olds was in good spirits, playing dress-up, naive to the fact that she was living in the epicenter of such chaos. When it was getting dark and nearing the national curfew President Sirleaf had enacted, my small crew and I still needed to make a return journey to residences outside of West Point, so we left. On our way out, I saw one of my friends from the World Health Organization who told me about a meeting taking place the next day with all of West Point's leaders, and she invited me to attend. I accepted, wanting to hear the community's thoughts on how to halt this nightmare. The meeting took place in a conference room at the Mamba Point Hotel, where 40 or so of West Point's community leaders had been granted special permission to leave the quarantine area in order to attend. The group included a government-appointed commissioner, the leaders of essential community organizations representing both West Point's youth and women, as well as community elders, and the heads of area churches and mosques. An executive of the World Health Organization who had flown into Liberia from Europe stood in front of the group of furious Liberians, many of whom had their arms crossed, while he addressed the rapidly escalating number of Ebola cases in West Point. Because of his heavy accent, few in the room could understand him, and I resisted the temptation to clamber up to the podium to interpret. When he concluded, this well-intentioned exec asked the community leaders who didn't understand much of what he'd said if they had any questions. Kenneth, a tall, big-bellied community leader with a formidable presence, spoke first, his sour face conveying his frustration as he described his community's anger and fear over the state of the quarantine. If we have to wait 21 days for the lockdown to be lifted, people will die, and our businesses will be in ruins, he said. This is intolerable, and on behalf of my community, we cannot accept another day of this. Other incensed community leaders cheered behind him. This was the only issue they were here to discuss, and they weren't budging until it was resolved. I feared something would be lost in translation, but West Pointers got their message through loud and clear. Eventually, the World Health Organization executive agreed to advocate to the president on the community's behalf to end the quarantine. Once he had left, I jumped up to make an announcement. Hey, if you don't know me, I'm Karina, the founder of the local Girls Academy. All of my students live in West Point, and I'll do anything to ensure their safety. What do you think is needed most right now, and how can my organization and I help? Kenneth replied without hesitation. When we call for an ambulance, we can't get one to come for 4 days, and by that time the person who is sick is beyond help and the whole family has contracted the virus. We need our own local ambulance. Can you help us to procure one? If I can, will you help find drivers and ambulance attendants? I asked. Everyone agreed, and it was decided. Our first priority would be to purchase an ambulance. I was in constant communication with a few key donors, so the money came in quickly. Within days, I had purchased what seemed like the last working ambulance available in all of Liberia. True to their word, the community leaders recruited some of our youth's fathers to be the heroic drivers and attendants. A friend of mine offered to assist Doctors Without Borders as they trained the team of volunteer first responders. After comprehensive training, I asked our core of emergency staff to come in one by one and demonstrate that they knew how to put on and take off their personal protective gear with their eyes closed. I had no intention of deploying a single one of them until they could do it flawlessly. There was no margin for error. Once the ambulance was registered, I called the National Dispatch, Art Vi, who promptly burst my bubble. We're glad that you have an ambulance, he said, but there are no ETUs available to bring anyone to. All the beds are full. ETU stood for Ebola Treatment Unit, the place patients were supposed to go for help when they were symptomatic with Ebola. So you're telling me we have an ambulance, we have trained staff, but there's nowhere to take sick people? I replied, tears welling up in my eyes. Yes, Karina, we're sorry. The situation was growing dire. Ebola cases were rising exponentially. Dozens of sick people were found lying stranded outside of the only 2 treatment units in Monrovia County that were packed to the gills, taxing the strength of their overly exhausted staff. It was critically important to transport the sick out from their homes in order to try and stem the rising tide of the illness. However, upon arriving, many received no meaningful treatment. Complicating this public health care crisis further was the fact that the symptoms for Ebola, which included headache, achy bones, the shakes, vomiting, and diarrhea, were copycat symptoms of malaria, which is extremely common in Liberia. This meant that many who were suffering from a highly treatable disease panicked and went to the overflow center to get an Ebola test. Inevitably, some of them would contract the killer virus in the process. It also meant that people who had contracted Ebola sometimes thought it was malaria, and when they elected to stay at home, they often ended up infecting their families and sometimes their neighbors. According to the World Health Organization, the virus carried with it a high fatality rate of up to 90%. History would prove that our ambulance reduced the wait time for sick patients from 4 days to 15 minutes.